Remember that scene in A Hard Day's Night where George Harrison stumbles into an advertising agency only to be mistaken for a young model candidate or whatever? That was a great scene, wasn't it? That's where we meet the character Simon Marshall, the quintessential out-of-touch ad man who's eager to sell the youth on the next big thing without really understanding what they want, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, that's what Simon is like.
You're listening to the Beatles 60 podcast.
So, one moment George is regarded as a potential trend-setting informant from the youth. What happens, of course, is that his authenticity does inadvertently make him a genuine trendsetter for a moment, until his blunt opinions give Simon a bad vibe, and George is ordered out. In the same way that A Hard Day's Night portrayed Simon as out of touch with real youth culture, the music industry of the early 60s, as we can see in these weekly music mags, was apparently brimming with figures just like him, desperate to predict and capitalize on what the youth would find cool, and to try to divine when on the calendar of youth trends the next big thing was due, and of course missing the mark by a wide margin, usually. Well, the irony in early 1964 was that they actually got it right with both Blue Beat and the Beatles. Or, to put it more accurately, the marketing admin finally caught up and got with it. Or I guess they had no choice but to be with it at this point. And that's a kind of interesting thing. Maybe that's the lesson. If there's a moral to A Hard Day's Night or a lesson for us in history from that film, it's kind of the turning point where the ad men aren't needed anymore to decide what the next big thing was going to be. The kids would have their say, basically. The new generation, it was such an enormous demographic, and they were so enthusiastic about things like the Beatles or dancing music. If you're a mod, you don't need to guess anymore. The era of guessing is now over. Maybe it was a very 1950s thing, kind of, or early 1960, 61, 62. It was a period of guessing. It's the interregnum between rock and roll in the late 50s and then finally the British invasion, now in the emerging mid-60s. So in those early 60s, that's maybe a time when the magazines really didn't know which way things were going to go, or was it going to be Calypso, or they couldn't predict. We remember the Beatles were trying to predict, and they didn't realize that they would be the next big thing. So they didn't need to predict some kind of fad. They would be it. It would be Beatle music.
What? Twister. Yeah.
Beatles 60, we're jumping around.
Okay, so how do we know all this? It's all probably in books. This isn't a new discovery. I'm not some kind of genius or anything. I just wanted to share with you the Beatles 60 way of living in the history itself in daily, sequential, literally daily, sequential review of the vintage media, photos exactly 60 years ago each day, first-hand experiences of group members from exactly 60 years ago, from things that happened, and of course, excerpts from biographies related to the same day. So we do rely on all the main Beatles authors, all the resources that are out there, but very specifically what they're all saying about this day 60 years ago, exactly 60 years in the past. With very little effort, we're just sort of reliving 1964, but it doesn't really take much work. It's a very passive way to learn. I love it. You can tell, right? I'm enthusiastic about this. Key point, insights jump out at us simply from the juxtaposition of that day's photos, audio or video clips from the day, along with stories about what happened that day and scans of what people were reading in the print media that day. Each day, we deeply immerse ourselves in that day 60 years ago, so we're full of context. Then that day ends, we wake up the next day, and so we're getting context in sequence, just like we all get in current daily life, right? And in your life right now, we're getting context in sequence in our everyday life. That should be a term used for understanding culture or for gaining insight into culture, context in sequence. Because that's all we're doing. Really. That's what we're sort of doing almost passively. It's implied in some fields of research in the humanities and interpretive social sciences, but if you do a search for the phrase context in sequence, you only find it in mathematics or also in LLMs, large language models, which are like artificial neural networks. So maybe I'm coining this term. Ooh. That makes me fancy. I mean, we should claim it for interpretive social science, like a method of longitudinal social research. Maybe if we say context in sequence in French, it'll magically become an academic thing. Wait, let me see. How do we do that? Contexte en séquence. Contexte en séquence. That sounds good. Like mise en scène sounds very fancy. Or better yet, German. Hold on. Kontext in der Reihenfolge. Kontext in der Reihenfolge. Our human insights gained from exposure to context in sequence isn't simply like rapid statistical trial and error like machines. We might be slower. You know, we humans, we are meat puppets. We might be slower, but we have empathy and tastes and common sense. There's no artificial version of that yet, and there won't be for a long time. But let's put the academic mumbo-jumbo aside. Instead, I'll just quickly share one example. This is going to be very impressive. You wait. Don't leave. Don't move on to another podcast. Stay with me. Listen. Just 6 days after the Beatles returned to London from America, and just 4 days after Prince Buster arrived from Jamaica, both of them through what would later be called Heathrow Airport, the music magazine Pop Weekly published an article headlined, "Blue Beat breaks out in a big way." And just so you understand, this is how we know. This is how we know what they were all talking about. This is just an example. And I'll read it aloud. Quote, "It looks as though the Blue Beat is going to be the big thing with mods this year. This dance, which has been popular with really with it teams for some time now, is getting a terrific boost on disc from the major record companies, and there is, of course, the Blue Beat label itself stepping up output of this throbbing, incessant beat. Based on original West Indian rhythms, the Blue Beat is now moving on from being the rave of small select bands of mods to become a nationwide craze, which seems to support the quote that what the mods do today, the rest of the country does tomorrow. End quote. This is just one example. We can see this month in 1964 that all the British weeklies were raving about the trend. It wasn't just Pop Weekly. This is just an example. The new Blue Beat craze was reported in Disc magazine and in the other music industry weeklies as well. We see this all happening at once. We see the scans because a main contributor to our group, Kevin, hi Kevin, posts these pages from the Music Press 60 years ago every week. So we're reading what the Beatles and Epstein and the guys at EMI were reading. We know exactly the publication date. We're probably reading it the same time 60 years later that those guys were reading it. Blue Beat was the new thing. We see this in many articles, but also in prominent advertisements from labels putting out these singles, like Prince Buster's song Madness. All these ads are also very informative for us in the British music weeklies from 60 years ago exactly. So, February ends and March begins like a lion, I guess. The Beatles filming is top news, but Blue Beat is also all over these pages.
Nothing to do to save his life, call his wife in. Go to a show, you hope she goes. I've got nothing to say, but it's okay. Good morning, good morning, good. Town is getting dark, everyone you see is full of life. It's time for tea and meet the wife. Somebody needs to know the time, glad that I'm here. Watching the skirt, you start to flirt, now you're in gear. Go to a show, you hope she goes. I've got nothing to say, but it's okay. Good morning, good morning, good. 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 Yeah, yeah. Good morning, good morning, good. Yeah. Good morning, good morning, That'll do. Somebody needs to know the time that I'm here.